Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a world that didn't always make sense. A world of kings and queens who made rules mostly because they could. A world of superstition, ego, and the occasional disastrous dinner party. So before we begin, make sure you're comfortable. The lights are low, the world outside is quiet, and your phone is probably glowing softly beside you. If you enjoy sinking into these calm corners of history, the strange, the forgotten, the faintly ridiculous, then settle in, subscribe, and stay a while. Because tonight's story is about how one person's terrible decision could ruin something for everyone, sometimes for centuries. History is full of great discoveries, beautiful art, and noble achievements. But it's also full of bans, rules against things that were once harmless or even fun. And more often than not, those bans exist because someone important made such a spectacle of themselves that society collectively decided, never again. Let's drift back now, to the Middle Ages. A time of flickering torches and endless rules. Of monks writing about sin, kings writing about taxes, and ordinary people just trying not to get caught doing something fashionable. We'll start, as many bad ideas begin, with shoes. The tale of the forbidden footwear. In the 1300s, Europe was obsessed with a new fashion trend. It was elegant, impractical, and faintly ridiculous, the pollane. These were shoes with toes so long and pointed they could easily double as weapons. They began, of all places, in Poland, which is how they got their name. The style spread quickly through courts and cities, because if there's one thing medieval nobles loved, it was proving they had more fabric than sense. At first, it was charming. A neat little flourish at the tip of a shoe. But as trends do, it spiraled. Soon the point stretched 6 inches. Then 10. Then a full 20 inches, curling like a question mark or pointing straight ahead like a spear. Men had to tie the ends to their knees with ribbons to keep from tripping. Servants sometimes carried their master's toes in hand when they walked. And yet, everyone at court admired it. Because, of course, ridiculous fashion only becomes more popular the worse it looks. The undisputed champion of this absurd trend was Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy. Philip was wealthy, vain, and eager to be remembered. He threw feasts that bankrupted villages and owned more velvet than a modern theater department. When it came to shoes, he took things personally. His pollanes were legendary, long, stuffed with moss to keep their shape, and probably capable of jousting on their own. He reportedly had a servant whose entire job was to make sure the points of his shoes didn't fold while he sat. His courtiers followed his lead, until the ducal court looked less like an assembly of nobles and more like a flock of storks that had wandered into a tapestry. Eventually, the church noticed. And when the medieval church noticed something, that was rarely a good sign. Priests began to condemn the shoes from pulpits, calling them instruments of pride and vanity. Sermons compared their shape to the devil's tail. One bishop declared that such footwear invited the demons to dwell at the feet of the wearer. But as always, people listened politely and went on wearing them anyway. That was, until the Pope himself got involved. In 1368, Pope Urban V officially condemned the style, calling it indecent. Which is rather impressive, considering what counted as decent in the 14th century. Finally, in England, King Edward IV passed a law limiting shoe points to 2 inches. Anyone caught with longer toes faced fines or confiscation. Just like that, the grand era of the pollane was over. One man's fashion obsession had ruined it for everyone else. The jousting ban that ended the party. Now, let's drift to something sharper, the noble art of jousting. For centuries, jousting was the perfect combination of danger, pride, and splintered wood. It was the medieval way of saying, "Look how brave and shiny I am." Knights trained for years to charge at each other with lances, trying not to die while looking gallant. Crowds adored it. Queens handed out favors. The whole thing was equal parts romance and blunt force trauma. But as with all things medieval, someone had to take it too far. That someone was King Henry II of France. Henry was athletic, proud, and just insecure enough to need constant public validation. When he wasn't reforming the state or trying to keep his mistresses quiet, he loved to compete. Jousting, he thought, proved that even kings were still knights at heart. In 1559, France signed a peace treaty with Spain. To celebrate, Henry held a magnificent tournament in Paris. There were banners, music, crowds, and warnings. His wife, Catherine de' Medici, begged him not to compete. His doctors told him it was unsafe. Even his astrologer predicted disaster. Naturally, Henry ignored them all. He rode out in gleaming armor to face a Scottish noble named Gabriel Montgomery. The first pass went smoothly. But Henry wanted another. On the second charge, Montgomery's lance splintered and drove straight through the king's visor, into his eye. Henry was carried off bleeding. The finest doctors in France gathered around him. They tried everything: potions, ointments, even drilling holes in his skull to release the evil humors. 10 days later, the king died. The court was horrified. Catherine was inconsolable. Montgomery, the poor man who'd killed the king by accident, was exiled. And jousting? Officially banned. Tournaments vanished from France almost overnight. Other countries took note. Even in England, where Henry VIII had once cracked his skull in a similar accident, enthusiasm for the sport waned. A pastime that had once symbolized chivalry became a relic. All because one king refused to sit out a match. The royal beard tax. Let's move east, to Russia, where another monarch managed to turn personal taste into national policy. For centuries, Russian men had worn long, flowing beards. They were more than fashion, they were sacred. Many believed shaving was sinful, an insult to God's design. Beards symbolized wisdom, faith, and masculinity. Then came Peter the Great. Peter wanted Russia to be modern, and to him, modern meant looking more like Western Europe. After visiting Holland and England, he decided that the bearded Russians looked hopelessly medieval. So, he banned beards. At first, people laughed. Surely, the Tsar was joking. But Peter was not known for his sense of humor. He issued a decree in 1698 stating that all men must shave. Those who refused had to pay a tax and carry a small copper token engraved with the words, "The beard is a useless burden." Guards stood at city gates with razors. Officials chased men through markets, shaving them on the spot. Some wept as they were trimmed, clutching their lost beards like relics. The clergy denounced the decree. Peasants hid their beards under scarves. One noble buried his shorn hair in his garden, convinced it would grow back in the afterlife. But Peter pressed on. Even his courtiers obeyed, terrified of his temper. Within a few years, the sight of a full beard in Moscow became rare and suspicious. An entire tradition, erased by one man's aesthetic preferences. The cheese scandal of Carmagnola. Next, let's drift south to Italy, where the proud art of cheesemaking once met its match in the stomach of a foolish nobleman. The story takes place around 1546, in the little Lombard town of Carmagnola. Its resident count, Carlo di Carmagnola, was known for three things: his temper, his vanity, and his appetite. To celebrate his daughter's engagement, he held a feast that would be talked about for years. The tables were piled high, roasted pheasants, glazed fruits, and finally, his pride and joy, a massive wheel of soft cheese, aged in his personal cellar. Carlo called it formaggio vivente, living cheese. Which, unfortunately, it was. When servants cut into it, dozens of small white maggots spilled out and began wriggling cheerfully across the tablecloth. The count beamed with pride. His guests, on the other hand, screamed. One fainted into her soup. Another prayed loudly for deliverance. Word spread quickly. The local bishop declared such cheeses a corruption of Christian nature. The town council banned all unstable inanimate dairy. Within a year, unpasteurized soft cheeses across Lombardy were under suspicion. Maggot cheese did survive in secret, but it would never again be served at noble banquets. Because one proud man couldn't tell the difference between delicacy and infestation. The wine ban of a petty emperor. Now for something to wash all that down, or, rather, not. In the 14th century, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV ruled over a vast patchwork of kingdoms. He was shrewd, devout, and almost pathologically sensitive about his crown. At one royal banquet, his cousin Count Rudolph of the Palatinate made a joke about that crown, comparing it to a gilded bucket. The court laughed. Charles didn't. Weeks later, Charles issued a decree forbidding Rudolph's region from exporting wine. It might sound trivial, but wine was the region's main industry. The ban ruined hundreds of vineyards. Towns went bankrupt. Farmers starved. When questioned, the emperor simply said the count must learn humility. The ban lasted long after his death, slowly strangling an entire valley, all because one man couldn't tolerate being the punchline. The lesson of medieval pettiness. And so, the Middle Ages carried on, shaped not only by war and faith, but by the fragile egos of the powerful. One duke's vanity ended a fashion. One king's pride ended a sport. One emperor's grudge destroyed a wine trade. A czar's insecurity erased centuries of tradition. And one Italian noble's cheese ended a whole culinary era. Each of them left behind a law or a ban that would ripple for generations, a rule that began not with reason, but with embarrassment. It's easy to think of the past as noble and dignified. But more often, it was absurd. Rules were written not to make life better, but to make someone feel important. Every kingdom had its own list of forbidden things, most of them ruined by a single person's spectacular mistake. So as you lie there, letting your thoughts drift and blur, remember, history isn't just made by the great and the good. Sometimes, it's made by the clumsy, the vain, and the easily offended. They tripped, they jousted, they banned, they sulked, and somehow, that became the foundation of civilization. So close your eyes. Let the noise of the day fade away. Because somewhere, deep in the dust of history, someone is still banning something. All because one person ruined it for everyone else. Hey everyone, still here, still awake? If you are, that's fine. Tonight, we're staying in the same dimly lit corner of medieval life, but moving from shoes and vanity to something a little more edible. Or, at least, it was supposed to be. Because medieval people had a talent for taking perfectly innocent food and turning it into a moral panic, a scandal, or a public health disaster. And once again, it usually only took one person, one accident, or one royal dinner gone wrong to get an entire meal, ingredient, or drink banned for generations. So pour yourself something gentle. Tea, maybe. Not wine, you'll see why soon enough. And let's drift through the medieval kitchen, where superstition, greed, and questionable hygiene met under the same smoky rafters. The Great Meat Pie Panic. Let's begin with a pie. Medieval Europe adored meat pies. They were rich, filling, inconvenient. The pastry wasn't just food, it was also a container, like the medieval version of Tupperware. A pie could travel long distances, last for days, and feed half a family. But in 1465, the humble pie suffered a terrible scandal in England. It began at the wedding feast of Lord William de Norbury, a minor noble with a major flair for excess. To impress his guests, he ordered the largest meat pie anyone had ever seen. It was said to contain venison, pheasant, pigeon, rabbit, and possibly something else best left unnamed. The pie was baked in the castle kitchens for nearly a day, then carried into the great hall with trumpets. It was enormous, nearly the size of a table, decorated with pastry flowers and gilded with beaten gold leaf. When servants cut it open, the crowd gasped. Out flew a flock of small birds. This was not an accident. Lord Norbury had ordered live birds baked into the crust for theatrical effect. They were supposed to fly out majestically when the pie was opened, symbolizing abundance and good fortune. Instead, half of them suffocated in the crust, the rest fluttered out in panic, and one landed in the soup tureen. The banquet descended into chaos. A priest declared it a mockery of creation, and several guests swore they saw it as an omen of doom. Within months, a local bishop condemned the practice of living pies. By 1470, English law forbade cruelty in the making of victuals. It was the medieval world's version of food safety regulation, inspired not by hygiene, but by embarrassment. All because one noble wanted a pie that could perform. The miracle fish that got away. Let's drift north now, to Scandinavia, where something that looked holy enough to worship soon became illegal to eat. In the 12th century, the people of Norway began reporting strange discoveries along their shores. Massive, boneless fish washed up after storms, long, pale, and shimmering. Some were mistaken for sea serpents. Others were declared miracles. Priests collected their bones. But these were not monsters or signs from heaven. They were whales. Specifically, parts of them, flesh, fat, and sometimes half-rotted carcasses, carried by the tide. Enter King Sigurd I, a man eager to be remembered for piety and progress. When he learned that peasants were carving up whale meat to eat, he was horrified. The church had classified whales as fish, meaning they could technically be eaten during Lent. But Sigurd found the idea repulsive and, more importantly, ungodly. He issued a royal decree banning all consumption of sea beasts that bleed warm. Anyone caught eating whale meat faced fines or public penance. The ban spread across northern Europe. For centuries afterward, whale meat was treated with suspicion, neither land food nor sea food, but something unnatural, something best left to God. Of course, centuries later, whale became a delicacy again. But for the entire medieval period, one man's queasiness about blubbery fish meant entire coastal towns had to pretend not to be hungry. The forbidden fruit of France. Next, we drift to France, where even fruit wasn't safe from overreaction. In 1257, a summer heat wave swept through the Loire Valley. Crops shriveled, wells dried, and fruit trees ripened too early. Desperate villagers gathered what they could: overripe plums, soft pears, and particularly sweet figs. That same summer, an outbreak of illness struck the region. People fell sick with cramps, fever, and delirium. Since no one knew about bacteria or spoiled produce, they blamed the obvious culprit, the figs. The rumor began that the figs were cursed, possibly touched by demons or witches. A local monk claimed to have seen a black vapor rising from a basket of them. Within days, figs were declared the fruit of plague. King Louis IX, who was already famous for his strict morality, ordered a royal investigation. It concluded, with all the medical rigor of the 13th century, that figs caused corruption of the blood and spirit. He banned their sale in Paris for nearly 20 years. Merchants were furious. Farmers uprooted fig trees in protest. But the royal decree stood. It wasn't until Louis's death that the fruit quietly returned to markets, its reputation badly bruised. One bad summer had been enough to nearly erase a fruit from French life. The beer that was too strong. Now we move to Germany, where beer has always been sacred. In the Middle Ages, beer was more than a drink, it was daily survival. Water wasn't always safe, and beer, brewed and boiled, was the safer alternative. Even children drank it. But around 1487, something strange began happening in the city of Munich. People were falling ill after drinking certain batches of ale. Not with plague or cholera, this was something else. They became dizzy, aggressive, even violent. Authorities suspected witchcraft, naturally. But the real culprit was a brewer named Hans Becher, who had been experimenting with ingredients. Specifically, he added henbane, a hallucinogenic herb, to make his beer stronger. The results were spectacular and deeply unfortunate. Customers reported seeing angels in their soup. One man claimed to have spoken with his dead horse. Another jumped into the Isar River because the beer told him to. Becher was arrested, tried for sorcery, and eventually exiled. The city council responded by drafting one of Europe's first beer purity laws, banning the use of anything but barley, hops, and water in brewing. That rule, known as the Reinheitsgebot, still shapes German beer today. All because one ambitious brewer decided his customers needed a mystical experience with their pint. The milk that broke the monks. Monasteries, as you might imagine, had a complicated relationship with food. Monks were expected to live simply, no luxury, no indulgence. But they were also excellent farmers, and they produced some of the finest food in medieval Europe. In one Benedictine monastery in Normandy, around 1320, the brothers became known for their butter and cream. Rich, golden, and indulgent, it drew travelers from miles around. The monks insisted it was for holy sustenance, though it clearly wasn't helping their vows of humility. Then came Lent, 40 days of fasting from all animal products. Butter, of course, was forbidden. But the monks loved their butter far too much to stop. They quietly ate it in secret, smuggling it into their meals. Eventually, word spread. The abbot of a neighboring monastery reported them to the bishop. The bishop, either deeply annoyed or deeply hungry, came up with a compromise. He declared that the monks could eat butter during Lent if they paid a tax for the privilege. That tax soon spread beyond the monastery, becoming official policy across France. Ordinary people who wanted butter in Lent could pay the beer indulgence. The church made a fortune. And so, a single group of butter-loving monks accidentally invented the concept of butter money, a religious loophole disguised as taxation. It wasn't exactly a ban, but it was close enough to make fasting season deeply inconvenient for everyone else. The Great Wine Rebellion. And now, inevitably, we reach wine, the drink that could never stay out of trouble. In medieval England, wine was both a luxury and a symbol. Imported from France, it marked the difference between nobility and everyone else. Ale was for the peasants, wine was for the privileged. But in 1387, a merchant named Thomas Runciman discovered a shortcut. He began watering down cheap French wine, adding herbs and honey to disguise the taste. It worked. His sweet claret became wildly popular in London. Unfortunately, it also became dangerous. The herbs he used, particularly pennyroyal and tansy, were toxic in large doses. Dozens of people fell ill. A few died. The city council panicked. They accused Runciman of poisoning the public, possibly on orders from the French. He fled, leaving behind barrels of his deadly concoction. The crown responded with a sweeping ban on flavored or tampered wines. For a while, even the addition of spice was illegal. Genuine vintners rejoiced, tavern owners despaired. The law remained in place for decades, shaping the English palate toward plain, unadulterated wine, all because one merchant decided to stretch his profits by stretching his product. The kingdom that banned breakfast. Of all the strange bans in medieval history, perhaps the most quietly tragic came from a small Italian principality, Ferrara. In 1392, Duke Niccolò II d'Este issued a proclamation forbidding the consumption of food before noon. Breakfast, he argued, made men lazy and sluggish. He had read somewhere, or imagined, that early eating dampened the vigor of body and mind. His courtiers, of course, pretended to agree. They fasted until midday, growing faint and irritable. Ordinary people, caught sneaking bread at dawn, could be fined. The policy lasted nearly 15 years. Farmers fainted in the fields, merchants whispered curses, and the Duke congratulated himself on running a disciplined city. After his death, breakfast quietly returned. Chroniclers later noted that Ferrara's productivity improved almost instantly, as though everyone had finally been allowed to wake up again. One man's misguided diet plan had starved an entire city for a generation. When taste became sin, so many medieval bans began not with logic, but with fear of indulgence, of contamination, of appearing too modern or too foreign. Food wasn't just nourishment. It was moral. Every bite carried spiritual weight. Eating the wrong thing at the wrong time could mark you as wicked, gluttonous, or godless. A pie could be vanity. A fig could be evil. A pint of beer could summon demons. And butter, somehow, could be worth a sin tax. The Middle Ages may have ended long ago, but that quiet human tendency remains, to take pleasure in something, ruin it, and then forbid it. So as you lie there, listening in the dark, imagine those old kitchens, smoky, bustling, full of rules no one really understood. A time when the line between feast and heresy was razor thin, and one ill-timed meal could change everything. History remembers kings and saints, but it also remembers the people who ruined dinner for everyone else. So sleep easy. You live in an age where your breakfast, your cheese, and your beard are still your own. At least, for now. Hey everyone, still here, still awake? If you are, that's fine. Tonight, we're not in the royal dining hall anymore. We're outside, under gray skies, where the streets smell faintly of mud, ale, and questionable enthusiasm. Because long before Netflix, smartphones, or even books most people could actually read, medieval Europe found other ways to entertain itself. Games, contests, festivals, moments of joy wedged awkwardly between plagues and taxes. And predictably, it didn't take long for people to ruin them. Some of these pastimes were banned because they became dangerous. Others because they were too rowdy, or too fun, or too blasphemous. But in nearly every case, the ban began with one person doing something spectacularly stupid. So let's drift through the fields and marketplaces of the Middle Ages, and watch as merriment slowly gets legislated out of existence. The ball game that started a war. Let's start in England. Naturally. In the 14th century, there was a game simply called football. Now, don't imagine modern football, no uniforms, no teams, and certainly no rules. It was more of a chaotic mob event played between two villages, usually involving an inflated pig's bladder and at least one lawsuit. The goal? Get the ball, or something vaguely ball-shaped, from one side of town to the other. Through streets. Over fences. Across rivers. Everything and everyone in the way was fair game. In 1314, the city of London finally had enough. Merchants complained their shops were being destroyed. Monks claimed it encouraged ungodly language. But the final straw came when two rival teams, from neighboring parishes, turned a match into an actual battle. Several people died. A few houses burned. One man lost his front teeth to what was described as a holy cudgel. King Edward II banned football entirely, calling it a devilish pastime of noise and confusion. His decree even mentioned that it distracted young men from practicing archery, which, apparently, was the approved way to commit violence. For 2 centuries, the game stayed illegal in most towns. Of course, people played it anyway, usually right under the noses of the guards. But officially, the first sport in England was outlawed not because it was dangerous, but because it was too popular for the king's liking. the festival that ate itself. Let's wander to France, where the church, bless its patience, once tried to outlaw laughter. The Feast of Fools was a winter festival held by clergy and commoners alike. It began as a light-hearted parody of the church itself, a harmless outlet during the dull, cold days after Christmas. Clerics would wear masks, sing bawdy songs, and elect a mock bishop to lead them. For a few hours, the world turned upside down, priests became jesters, altar boys gave sermons, and everyone laughed at authority. Naturally, it got out of hand. By the 1200s, the feast had turned into an annual drunken riot. Churches were filled with shouting, gambling, and occasional livestock. One chronicler described clergy dancing in the choir in obscene fashion, which, to be fair, must have been unforgettable. Then, in 1445, it all went too far. In Paris, a group of revelers staged their feast inside Notre Dame itself. They brought wine, animals, and what can only be described as medieval pyrotechnics. The fire spread, damaging parts of the cathedral. The Archbishop of Paris had seen enough. The festival was outlawed across France. Participants could be fined, whipped, or excommunicated. It was the end of organized chaos, and the beginning of centuries of dull, obedient winter sermons. The church had reclaimed control. But you can almost hear the collective sigh of Europe's bored clergy. The game that cost too many fingers. Now, over to Scotland, where they found a way to combine friendship, competition, and bodily harm into one wholesome activity. It was called shinty. A simple enough game, 2 teams, curved sticks, and a small wooden ball. The idea was to hit the ball into the opposing goal. Think field hockey, but with no rules, no safety, and unlimited enthusiasm. The problem wasn't the sport itself, it was what people brought to it. Axes, clubs, occasionally, their family grudges. In 1424, King James I banned all games of stick and ball within city limits. The official reason, too many broken bones among the nobility. Unofficially, a certain Earl of Mar had lost 2 fingers in a particularly violent match and insisted the sport was a tool of the devil. Of course, in true Scottish fashion, people ignored the ban. They just moved the matches to hillsides, where the law was slower to catch up. Even today, shinty survives, less bloody, more civilized, but its medieval origins remain a reminder that fun was always one bruise away from illegality. The tournament that broke a king. The medieval tournament was supposed to be the height of chivalry, shining armor, gallant knights, cheering crowds. In reality, it was medieval NASCAR, dangerous, expensive, and occasionally fatal. Kings loved tournaments. They were grand theater, a way to display power and skill without actual war. But inevitably, someone would take it too far. In 1240, at a joust held near Mainz, a knight's lance splintered mid-strike. A shard pierced the eye of King Henry VII of Germany. He survived, barely, but was left permanently disfigured and half-blind. The Church, which had always been wary of these mock wars, used the accident to push for bans. Several popes declared tournaments sinful, claiming they led to pride, death, and unnecessary widows. For a time, they succeeded. Jousting and melee games were forbidden across much of Christendom. Naturally, the nobility responded by hosting them in secret, calling them training exercises. The bans only made the sport more glamorous, because nothing says nobility like risking your life for applause and vanity. The song that got its composer arrested. Entertainment wasn't limited to physical games. Sometimes, a catchy tune could cause just as much trouble. In 1310, a wandering minstrel named Pierre Dupont wrote a song mocking the local lord of Rouen, a harmless bit of satire, or so he thought. The refrain went, "The Lord eats well, though the village starves, but his horses are thin from shame." It spread fast. Taverns, markets, even children were singing it. Within weeks, the song reached the castle. The Lord, predictably, was not amused. Pierre was arrested and charged with sedition through melody. The city's magistrates issued a decree forbidding all songs that mocked those of noble blood. Musical censorship had arrived. But here's the thing, the ban only made people love the song more. They hummed it in secret, added verses, and passed it down. Centuries later, a version of it survived in French folk tradition, a quiet rebellion disguised as a lullaby. One tune, one insult, and an entire genre of satire outlawed overnight. The horse race that turned into a revolution. Let's drift south to Italy again, to Siena, in the late 1200s. Before the famous palio races we know today, the city held chaotic horse contests through narrow, winding streets. The riders were young, often drunk, and occasionally armed. It was festive. Until it wasn't. In 1289, two rival neighborhoods, the Contrada dell'Oca and the Contrada della Torre, turned their friendly race into an outright riot. Spectators threw stones. Horses collided. A nobleman was trampled to death. The city government, humiliated, banned all races within Siena's walls. They even forbade citizens from keeping racing horses without a license. But people missed the chaos. By the 17th century, Siena quietly brought the race back, rebranded, sanitized, and fenced in. The modern palio was born, complete with flags, drums, and just enough danger to keep things interesting. It remains a symbol of medieval persistence, proof that no ban, however stern, can kill a tradition that makes people forget their peasants for one afternoon. The Holy Week of Mayhem. Let's return to England for something that truly confuses historians, the Festival of Asses. It began innocently, as a celebration of the donkey that carried Mary and Jesus into Egypt. Towns would hold small processions with real donkeys, hymns, and blessings. But by the 13th century, things had escalated. People dressed as donkeys, brayed during sermons, and drank to the holy ass. In one village, they even brought a live donkey into the church, placed it before the altar, and sang to it. Predictably, the bishop was not amused. He banned the practice, calling it a perversion of Christian joy. Across Europe, similar festivals were shut down one by one, mostly because the line between worship and mockery had become impossible to tell. And yet, one can almost sympathize. If you lived in a time when disease and famine lurked at every turn, pretending to be a donkey for a day might have felt like a small act of freedom. When fun became a sin. By the late Middle Ages, Europe had developed a complicated relationship with joy. Leisure was suspicious. Laughter was risky. Anything that distracted from prayer, work, or obedience could be, and often was, banned. Kings feared crowds. The church feared mockery. And the people, somehow, kept finding ways to dance, sing, and play anyway. Every time a pastime disappeared, another emerged. When football was outlawed, wrestling took its place. When songs were censored, jokes traveled by whisper. And when tournaments were banned, knights invented duels. The human impulse to play never vanished, it just adapted. So as you lie there now, maybe thinking about the strange things humans once outlawed, pies, figs, songs, donkeys, remember this. Most bans didn't come from evil or cruelty. They came from embarrassment. From fear of losing control. One man mocked a lord, one monk danced in a cathedral, one brewer got too creative, and the laws of an entire kingdom changed. That's history in its quiet, sleepy form. Not grand battles or great discoveries, but 1,000 tiny moments of overreaction. So close your eyes now. Let the noise fade. Tomorrow's world, like the medieval one, will still find something new to forbid, probably fun, probably harmless, and almost certainly because of one person who couldn't behave at a party. Sleep well. You've survived another age of foolishness. Hey everyone, still here, still awake? If you are, that's fine. Tonight, we're leaving the muddy fields and noisy fairs behind, and stepping quietly into the candlelit corridors of the wealthy. Because for every peasant who got fined for playing football or growing figs, there was a noble somewhere being scolded for wearing something too shiny. Medieval rulers, as it turns out, were obsessed with controlling what people wore. What you could put on your body said everything about who you were, your class, your worth, your place in the cosmic order. And naturally, when people started looking too good, someone decided that was unacceptable. So tonight, let's wander through the wardrobes of medieval Europe, the silks, jewels, perfumes, and feathers that were all, at one point or another, banned because they made the wrong person look too interesting. The sumptuary law problem. It all began with what historians call sumptuary laws. That's a polite term for rules that tell you what not to wear. By the 13th century, kings and councils across Europe were panicking about fashion. Merchants were getting rich. Commoners were buying imported fabrics. Servants were showing up to church looking almost respectable. This could not stand. England led the way. In 1337, King Edward III, who never met a law he didn't enjoy enforcing, passed a sweeping decree: no one under the rank of knight could wear fur, silk, or velvet. Even the width of your sleeves was regulated. The longer your sleeves, the higher your rank. The logic was simple: if everyone looked wealthy, how would anyone know who to bow to? Naturally, people ignored the law. Tailors got creative. Commoners layered plain wool to mimic silk folds, used fake trim, or borrowed clothing for events. Edward kept tightening the rules until they became absurd. By 1363, he went further, dictating what each income bracket could wear. If you earned less than 20 pounds a year, no cloth of gold for you. If you made less than 40 pounds, you couldn't wear imported fabric. And if you were a servant, well, you were expected to dress soberly in russet or blue, without ornament. Which is a poetic way of saying, please look boring, so we can tell. The fur that offended a king. Let's move to France, where the war on luxury took a slightly furrier turn. In the 14th century, fur was everything. It meant wealth, warmth, and divine favor, because clearly, God wanted you to be cozy. But not all furs were equal. There was squirrel for the modest rich, ermine for the truly royal, and then there was lynx, soft, rare, and dangerously seductive. King Charles V of France decided it was too seductive. One winter, during a feast at his court, several ladies of noble birth arrived wearing lynx-trimmed cloaks. Charles's queen, Jean, wore only ermine, the correct royal fur. But under candlelight, the lynx shimmered in shades of gray and silver that looked almost the same. Guests began confusing noble women for the queen herself. It was, of course, a scandal. Charles issued a royal ordinance declaring lynx fur unfit for all but the highest blood. He even fined one duchess who refused to stop wearing it, confiscating her cloak and donating it to the glory of God, which is to say, to the royal wardrobe. Lynx fur promptly vanished from French fashion, not because it was sinful, but because it made the king feel less special. The crisis of the long-toed shoes. Now, let's talk about shoes, specifically, the pelaine. Imagine a leather shoe with a ridiculously long, pointed toe, the medieval equivalent of high-fashion sneakers. The tip could be half a foot long, sometimes more. Wealthy men stuffed the points with wool or moss to keep them rigid. They were elegant, absurd, and completely impractical. By the late 1300s, the trend got out of hand. Noblemen strutted through castles with shoes so long they had to tie the ends to their knees with strings to avoid tripping. The church was horrified. Priests claimed the shoes were symbols of vanity and sin, the devil's claws made manifest. King Edward IV eventually banned pollaines over 2 inches long, threatening fines or imprisonment. Naturally, everyone just started measuring in secret. In Germany, one duke tried to enforce a similar rule. His soldiers stopped people in the streets to measure their shoes. One merchant, caught wearing forbidden footwear, allegedly bribed his way out with a roasted goose. Fashion, as always, survived the law. But for nearly a century, the pointy shoe remained the most controversial object in Europe. The perfume scandal of Venice. Drifting south now, to Venice, a city that practically invented luxury. In the 15th century, Venetian merchants imported exotic perfumes from the East. They came in small glass vials, sealed with wax and sold for absurd sums. Perfume was considered sensual, mysterious, even dangerous. And in 1474, the city council decided it was too dangerous. Rumors spread that Venetian courtesans were using perfume to bewitch noblemen, particularly the married ones. One senator claimed his friend had been enchanted by scent and bankrupted himself buying gifts for a woman who smelled of amber and roses. That was enough for the government to intervene. They issued a ban on the public use of strong perfume, at least during daylight hours. Of course, it didn't work. The ban simply made perfume more fashionable. Women began wearing it only at night, calling it the moon's indulgence. The church, predictably, denounced it again a few years later, describing it as temptation in liquid form. Even so, Venice kept smelling wonderful and slightly scandalous for the rest of the century. The forbidden colors. Color, too, was a matter of politics. In the Middle Ages, dyes were expensive. Certain shades, like deep crimson or royal purple, could only be made from rare ingredients, cochineal, madder, or shellfish. So rulers did what they always did: they banned them for anyone who wasn't important. In Florence, only nobles could wear scarlet. In Castile, purple was reserved for the royal family. And in England, the color Tyrian purple was so restricted that tailors had to swear oaths not to sell it to those of common blood. But people have always loved forbidden things. So they cheated. Merchants sold mock purple, a clever blend of blue and red dye that looked similar under candlelight. When King Henry VI discovered the deception, he issued a new law stating that even imitations of royal colors were a punishable offense. Imagine being fined for wearing the wrong shade of violet. That was medieval fashion. The armor of vanity. You might think armor would be safe from fashion laws. It's functional, after all. But no! By the 15th century, armor had become an art form. Wealthy knights commissioned gilded breastplates, engraved gauntlets, and helmets with elaborate plumes. Some were so ornate they barely worked in battle. In Burgundy, Duke Philip the Good noticed his soldiers gleaming like gold idols on the battlefield and decided it was unbecoming. He banned gilded armor, declaring it a distraction from God's glory. The irony, of course, was that Philip himself owned at least 6 golden suits of armor for ceremonial occasions. As one chronicler drily noted, the Duke forbade that which he most enjoyed. And in that sentence, you can hear the entire philosophy of medieval law. The jewels that sparked the riots. Now, let's drift to the German city of Nuremberg, where jewels caused more trouble than any army. In 1370, a wealthy merchant's wife, Anna Meinhard, attended mass wearing a jeweled belt. It wasn't particularly large, but it sparkled, and she wasn't noble. A countess sitting nearby took offense. She reported Anna for presuming above her station. The city council overreacted magnificently. They passed a law banning all jewelry for women below the rank of knight's wife. Within weeks, protests erupted. Goldsmiths lost business. Brides demanded exceptions. The law became impossible to enforce. Eventually, the council amended it, allowing one modest ornament upon the person. People immediately interpreted modest to mean as large as possible without falling off. By the next year, Nuremberg glittered more than ever. The law quietly disappeared, never mentioned again. The outlawed hairstyles. Even hair wasn't safe. In 1388, the French court banned horned headdresses, tall, cone-shaped constructions of fabric and wire that noble women wore like medieval skyscrapers. Some were so tall they brushed doorways. The church declared them symbols of pride and moral decay. Priests preached sermons against towering heads, claiming they disturbed the angels. One bishop even claimed he saw a woman's headdress block a candle during prayer and declared it a divine warning. The ban spread across France, Burgundy, and England. Women simply made their headdresses shorter, but wider. One chronicler sighed, "They resemble sails upon a ship." Nothing says law enforcement failure quite like a room full of nobles trying to outdo each other in forbidden millinery. The Velvet Revolution. Let's end with a quiet act of defiance. In 1468, Florence banned velvet clothing for anyone below the merchant elite. Velvet was expensive, imported, and a visible sign of wealth. But within a decade, tailors found a loophole: woolen velvet. It wasn't real velvet, but it looked close enough. Soon, even apprentices wore it. The city council held emergency meetings, furious that the lower classes had found a way to look elegant without permission. One official wrote bitterly, "The world has turned upside down, even the butcher's son wears velvet to vespers." Eventually, the law collapsed under its own absurdity. Because no amount of royal decree can make people stop wanting to look good. When appearance became a weapon. The funny thing about all these bans is how deeply they reveal the insecurity of those in charge. Kings and queens didn't ban fashion because it was sinful, they banned it because it was competitive. The fear wasn't about vanity. It was about confusion. If a merchant looked like a noble, if a servant smelled like a duchess, if a woman's shoes were more fashionable than the queen's, the entire illusion of hierarchy started to wobble. Medieval society ran on appearance. It wasn't just class, it was theater. And every sumptuary law was an attempt to keep the curtain from slipping. But, as history shows, vanity is stronger than law. People still dyed their cloths, wore long shoes, used perfume, and built ridiculous hairstyles, because beauty, even in an age of filth and famine, was still a kind of rebellion. So as you lie there now, drifting, picture it, the rustle of forbidden silk in candlelight, the whisper of perfume in a narrow alley, the quiet joy of someone putting on something they weren't supposed to. In a world that outlawed pleasure, style became its own quiet act of defiance. And maybe that's why the Middle Ages look so dramatic in paintings, not because everyone was miserable, but because even in misery, they refused to look dull. Sleep easy, then. You'd fit right in. Hey everyone, still here, still awake? If you are, that's fine. Tonight, we're gliding into one of those delightfully absurd corners of the medieval world, where something seemingly harmless, like a goose, could become a royal scandal, a civic disaster, or, naturally, a banned phenomenon. The Middle Ages were full of rules, decrees, and proclamations made because one person, or sometimes an entire village, just couldn't behave. And by now, you can probably sense a theme. Whenever something was outlawed, it wasn't because it was inherently dangerous. It was because someone made it weird. So, let's begin with the goose. It's hard to imagine a less threatening animal, really. Fluffy, honking, domesticated. But by the 14th century, European nobles had turned goose ownership and consumption into a symbol of class and chaos. In parts of England, the annual goose fair was a beloved autumn tradition. Peasants brought geese to town, nobles pretended to haggle, and everyone went home mildly drunk. Harmless, right? Until, of course, one lord, a certain Sir Geoffrey de Somerville, decided to weaponize the birds. As the story goes, he was feuding with another local noble over land rights. Instead of an army, he released several dozen geese into his rival's estate, after tying small oil-soaked torches to their feet. The result was spectacular and devastating. Several barns caught fire. Crops were destroyed. A few servants panicked and fled into the woods. The event became known as the Flaming Goose Affair, and shortly after, the Crown issued a ban on the use of birds as incendiary devices. Which feels obvious now, but apparently needed to be clarified at the time. From there, goose-related restrictions spread quickly. Some towns banned goose fights, which had inexplicably become popular among bored merchants. Others outlawed serving goose liver to clergy, after one bishop reportedly hoarded so much of it during Lent that the local poor starved. And somewhere between all this avian madness, geese themselves gained an odd reputation, symbols of vanity, gluttony, and divine punishment. So the church joined in, banning goose feasts on certain holy days. All because a handful of nobles couldn't leave their birds alone. Let's drift a little south, to France, where the bans got even stranger. In medieval Paris, public baths were once vibrant social spaces. People went to gossip, eat, sometimes flirt, sometimes sin. But in 1412, a certain duke's mistress was caught bringing her pet goose into the bathhouse, and allegedly using it to amuse guests by teaching it to nibble bread from between their lips. The clergy were horrified. That particular bathhouse was shut down within a week, and a sweeping ban followed: no live animals in public baths, ever. Which, really, shouldn't have needed legislation. But again, medieval Europe thrived on reactive governance, the kind that only appears after something deeply embarrassing has already happened. And so, for centuries after, the humble goose carried a strange burden, a creature both sacred in folklore and scandalous in history. Now, while geese were being outlawed, another seemingly innocent medieval pastime was also falling apart: the art of throwing things at people. In early village festivals, throwing competitions were common, tossing stones at posts, cabbages at barrels, or, in one disturbing variant, rats at each other's feet. But the most infamous of all was the apple toss. This game began in 13th century Germany, and its rules were simple. A group of villagers stood in a circle while one person in the center tried to dodge apples thrown at them. The goal was to last as long as possible. Naturally, the apples soon turned into turnips. Then rocks. Then whatever was lying around. The inevitable happened in 1287, in the town of Hildesheim, when a local tax collector joined the game and suffered a fractured skull from an overzealous throw. The town council, worried about bad press, issued a ban on any fruit or root projectile meant for entertainment. But people are creative. The ban didn't stop them, it just made things weirder. A few decades later, someone invented the feather toss, where players hurled handfuls of goose feathers instead of apples. It was meant to mock the old law, and eventually, this parody evolved into a mocking chant sung at harvest festivals. Thrown out the fruit, lest taxmen weep. Toss feathers high, and lawmen sleep. The irony was lost on no one. By the late 1400s, even feathers and geese had become cultural symbols of rebellion, gentle reminders that authority always finds something to outlaw, even when it's harmless. Let's drift now to Italy. Because where England and France outlawed silly things for being dangerous, Italian city-states banned them for being unfashionable. Take Florence, for example. In the 15th century, Florentine tailors competed to make the most lavish hats imaginable. These weren't hats in the modern sense, they were towering sculptures of velvet, gold, and sometimes literal fruit. One merchant's wife famously wore a headdress so tall that she couldn't enter church without ducking. And that, predictably, became a problem. In 1468, the city issued a decree forbidding any hat taller than 1.5 palms, roughly 13 inches. The punishment for violating this? Public shaving of the offending hair and confiscation of the hat, which must have been quite a sight. Naturally, people immediately tried to find loopholes. Some wore wide hats instead of tall ones. Others disguised their headpieces as portable shrines to saints, claiming religious exemption. The city responded by banning those, too. By 1490, the official hat prohibition had expanded to cover everything from jeweled belts to scented gloves. It wasn't just fashion anymore, it was a moral crusade against excess. And yet, despite decades of regulation, people never stopped pushing the limits. It's a recurring medieval theme, really. One person's vanity becomes everyone else's inconvenience. Speaking of vanity, few bands captured that spirit more perfectly than the Mirror Edict of Venice. Around 1300, Venetian glassmakers had begun crafting mirrors so exquisite that even royal courts abroad wanted them. But one noblewoman, Contessa Giuliana di Rossi, reportedly spent so many hours staring into hers that her husband accused her of neglecting her soul. The rumor spread quickly, as rumors do. Soon, mirrors were said to invite vanity, lust, and demonic temptation. Priests warned that reflections could trap the soul. In 1314, the Venetian Senate, tired of moral complaints, issued a temporary ban on the domestic sale of mirrors to unmarried women. It lasted only a few years, but the reputation stuck. For centuries, Venetian mirrors were seen as both beautiful and mildly cursed. So, in the span of just a few decades, Italy managed to ban hats, mirrors, gloves, and perfumes. Not because they were harmful, but because someone always took it too far. Let's wander north again, to the chill of Scandinavia, where the bans were, unsurprisingly, more practical. In medieval Norway, skiing was a common mode of travel. Hunters used simple wooden skis to glide across snow in winter, and children learned early. But in 1278, the king's cousin, Prince Haakon, famously broke his leg while showing off during a royal hunt. The story spread like wildfire. The noble prince, laid low by his own enthusiasm. So naturally, the king issued an immediate royal decree: no nobleman shall ski in public contests. This ban lasted well into the 14th century and created a peculiar cultural split. Peasants could ski, nobles could not. Which, in its own way, might be the most medieval form of justice imaginable. By the time later kings reversed the rule, the damage was done. Skiing had become unfashionable among the elite, something rustic and beneath their dignity. All because one royal fell down too hard in the snow. It's strange how often these bans come from personal embarrassment. A goose fire here, a hat too tall there, and suddenly, an entire nation adjusts its laws. But perhaps the most ridiculous of all came from Hungary, around the early 1300s, where nobles banned the color purple. Not for moral or religious reasons, but because of a feud. The Duke of Transylvania, Miklos of Sac, attended a royal banquet wearing a robe of rare Tyrian purple. It was expensive, imported, and meant to impress. Unfortunately, the king's brother, who also happened to be wearing purple, took offense. He claimed the duke was mocking his rank. The resulting argument escalated into a public shouting match, followed by a spilled goblet, and, eventually, a duel that never officially took place because both men's retainers started brawling before it began. The king, furious and embarrassed, decreed that no one but the royal family could wear purple ever again. Which sounds like a petty solution, but it's the kind of pettiness that built medieval Europe one decree at a time. So, from Hungary to Venice, from Florence to Norway, the story stays the same. One person makes a fool of themselves, and the rest of the continent has to live with the consequences. And maybe that's the true essence of medieval bans: not law, not order, but the world's longest list of social lessons learned the hard way. Don't attach fire to geese. Don't duel over dye. Don't wear architecture on your head. Don't ski faster than your dignity allows. Simple rules, really. Ones we might still need today, in spirit if not in practice. As the candles burn lower and the echoes of laughter fade into the stone halls of history, the world feels quieter now. Those bans, those odd little decrees, are reminders that humanity's strangest ideas often start with someone's small, silly mistake. And that's how the Middle Ages worked, not through logic, but through embarrassment, written into law. Let's drift further into the night, because there are still a few more things humanity decided to outlaw, for reasons no one entirely remembers anymore. But that's a story for another part. Hey everyone, still here, still awake? If you are, that's perfectly fine. Tonight, we're wandering a little deeper into the fog of medieval absurdity, into the quiet corridors of history where rules were written not with intention, but with confusion. You see, not every ban from the Middle Ages came from outrage or moral panic. Some came from accidents, mistranslations, bureaucratic chaos, and occasionally, a royal scribe who just had a bad day. So, let's start in England, as so many regrettable regulations do. Around the year 1354, during the reign of Edward III, the royal clerks were tasked with drafting a new ordinance to standardize market weights. It was meant to stop merchants from cheating customers, a noble cause, really. The law was supposed to ban the sale of false stones, meaning fake weights made of light materials. Unfortunately, the Latin translation used the phrase lapides falsi, which later copyists misread as lapides folii, leaf stones. For reasons no one could quite explain, the resulting English translation circulated as, "Let no man sell stones of leaf, under penalty of forfeiture." Which, of course, made no sense. Merchants, confused and slightly terrified, took it to mean that leaf-shaped stones were now illegal. Jewelers panicked. Decorative masons quietly removed floral carvings from church walls. A minor wave of architectural anxiety swept the country. By the time anyone realized the mistake, the phrase had entered local legend. People genuinely believed that stones carved in the shape of leaves carried bad luck or were forbidden by the crown. It was quietly corrected in later documents, but the superstition outlived the law by centuries. Even in the 17th century, rural churches sometimes avoided leaf patterns in their masonry, all because of one sleepy scribe's handwriting. Let's drift over to Germany, where things got even more delightfully confusing. In 1481, the city of Lübeck was revising its trade ordinances. One rule was meant to regulate bakers of rye and malt, requiring that their loaves meet certain standards of size and purity. But when the local clerk translated the rule into Low German, the phrase Maltenbacker, malt bakers, was accidentally written as Maltenbecker, which, amusingly, could also mean painters of barley. For nearly 2 decades, the city guild enforced a completely nonsensical restriction. Painters were forbidden from using pigments derived from barley husks, something no sane painter had ever done to begin with. It was only in the early 1500s that a city inspector, reviewing the old scrolls, realized the absurdity. The painters were bewildered. The bakers were delighted. And the city council issued a quiet apology, calling the confusion unfortunate but thoroughly entertaining. Sometimes, medieval bureaucracy was like that, halfway between tragedy and farce. Now, if you travel down to Spain, you'll find an even stranger accident. In the late 1200s, King Alfonso X, known as Alfonso the Wise, commissioned a massive legal code called Las Siete Partidas. It was supposed to be the great unifying body of law for Castile. But in the process, some scribes copied sections incorrectly. One clause was meant to forbid hunting in holy places. It read, originally, que ninguno case en los lugares santos. But in one version, a scribe dropped a single letter. The word case, to hunt, became case, to marry. And so, for a brief and deeply confusing period, certain regions of Spain enforced a law that forbade marrying in holy places. In other words, no church weddings. Naturally, priests ignored it. Nobles protested. And for about 20 years, local magistrates found themselves in the awkward position of explaining that yes, technically, the king's law forbade marriages in churches, but also, no, that's not what it actually meant. Eventually, Alfonso's successors fixed the error, but not before it left a small linguistic fossil in Iberian folklore, the phrase casar sin altar, to marry without the altar, which later came to mean a secret or shameful union. So, through a single misplaced letter, Spain accidentally banned weddings in churches. And that, in a way, captures the essence of medieval lawmaking: grand in ambition, fragile in execution, and occasionally just a comedy of ink. Let's move to France now, where royal clerks had a particular talent for self-inflicted confusion. In the early 1300s, King Philip IV, also known as Philip the Fair, though his personality was anything but, issued a sweeping law to standardize tariffs on imported goods. The decree listed every taxable item by category: wine, salt, wool, spices, and so on. But a clerk, transcribing the section on spices, accidentally replaced epics with épées, swords. For several months, customs officials genuinely believed that imported spices were tax-free, while imported swords required a luxury tax. Merchants immediately exploited the loophole. They filled barrels with cinnamon and pepper, declared them military supplies, and shipped them tax-free across borders. By the time the mistake was discovered, the treasury had lost thousands of livres, and Philip was furious. He revoked the entire section, then banned the importation of both swords and spices for a year, until clarity could be restored. So yes, for 12 months, France accidentally outlawed both warfare and good cooking. Let's pause a moment to appreciate that. Now, we drift toward the Papal States, because even the Church had its bureaucratic mishaps. Sometime in the 12th century, the Vatican issued an edict against unnatural unions. It was meant, of course, to condemn certain relationships among clergy. But the Latin phrasing, contra naturam coniunctions, was copied incorrectly in one version as contra naturam conjunctions bestiarum, or against the natural joining of beasts. A few zealous bishops, apparently misunderstanding the context entirely, took it to mean that breeding animals was sinful. So in some small towns, farmers were actually fined for letting their livestock mate without clerical supervision. Monks were briefly appointed to oversee breeding pens, and rural priests found themselves blessing pigs and oxen to ensure lawful union. The confusion lasted about 2 years before someone in Rome finally clarified that no, the decree wasn't about cows. But by then, several local abbeys had written detailed treatises on spiritual livestock management, which remained in circulation for centuries as embarrassing footnotes. One can only imagine the sermons. And it wasn't just Europe, either. Across the Mediterranean, in the Byzantine Empire, laws occasionally tripped over themselves in spectacular fashion. In Constantinople, around the 10th century, Emperor Constantine VII issued a law forbidding the use of purple sails on non-royal ships. Purple dye was reserved for imperial vessels, and using it without permission was considered treason. But a bureaucrat, transcribing the decree, miswrote the Greek word for sails, histia, as fish, ichthia. Suddenly, merchants thought purple fish were banned. Fishermen panicked. Markets hid their dyed mackerel and salted tuna. One chronicler records an entire debate among traders over whether squid ink counted as a purple pigment. Eventually, the imperial court corrected the decree, but not before several coastal governors proudly reported having purged the markets of treasonous fish. That is the level of medieval literalism we're dealing with. And yet, in their confusion, there's something almost charming. These were societies trying to make sense of law, language, and authority with tools that barely fit together. The human element was always visible, a sleepy scribe, a misheard phrase, a nervous official overreacting. Now, if we head back west to England one more time, there's one final, perfectly absurd accident to mention. Around 1408, in the city of York, the local council attempted to ban noisy instruments during Lent, trumpets, drums, and the like. But due to a transcription error, the ordinance recorded it as noisy instruments of Lent. No one knew what that meant. For weeks, people whispered about what these Lenten instruments could possibly be. Some thought it referred to religious relics. Others believed it meant bells. And a few decided to interpret it as a ban on spoons. The confusion grew so widespread that markets briefly stopped selling metal cutlery altogether, just to be safe. By Easter, half the town was eating with their hands. Eventually, the council clarified, too late, of course. The people of York had already developed a small folk tradition of silent feasts, dining without clinking utensils during Lent. That tradition, in some places, still lingers today, a faint echo of one miswritten line. It's funny, in a way. These accidental bans didn't just inconvenience people, they reshaped culture, created superstitions, and left behind fragments of behavior that outlived their context. A leaf pattern avoided in stonework. A song mocking feather throwers. A superstition about purple fish. All ripples of a pen slipping on parchment hundreds of years ago. And maybe that's what makes this all so oddly human. Laws, for all their authority, are fragile things easily warped by misunderstanding. Medieval Europe wasn't just ruled by kings or popes, it was ruled by handwriting. So as the candles burn lower, imagine a monk somewhere, rubbing his eyes after hours of copying Latin by candlelight. His ink runs thin. His hand slips. And just like that, an entire nation finds itself outlawing geese, hats, or weddings, by mistake. History is full of grand empires and bloody wars, yes. But it's also full of moments like this, small, sleepy accidents that shaped centuries of habit and superstition. And in their own quiet way, those might be the most enduring legacies of all. So rest easy tonight knowing that somewhere in the archives of Europe, there's probably still a law on the books that bans something ridiculous, something no one remembers, caused by someone who was simply tired. The kind of tired that makes you mix up fish and sails. The kind of tired that writes history by accident. Hey everyone, still here, still awake? If you are, that's fine. Tonight we're wandering through the echoing marble halls of power, where kings, queens, and assorted self-appointed geniuses decided that the best way to fix society was to declare something illegal and then immediately ignore it. Because when you're a medieval monarch, everything looks solvable with parchment and a wax seal. And so, over the centuries, Europe became a patchwork of royal decrees that fixed nothing, changed nothing, and in many cases, made everything hilariously worse. Let's start in England. Because, well, England practically made this into an art form. In the late 13th century, King Edward I, a man better known for conquering Wales and expelling the Jews from England, decided to tackle the nation's economic instability. His bold solution? A royal decree limiting how much money people could spend at funerals. Yes, funerals. Apparently, noble families had been competing to host the most extravagant death parties imaginable, gold-lined coffins, imported incense, enormous feasts, and mourners paid to sob theatrically for hours. So Edward decreed that no funeral feast should serve more than 40 loaves of bread, no more than a single barrel of ale, and no more than one roasted ox. Naturally, everyone ignored it. We know this because within 2 years, he issued the same decree again, this time threatening to seize estates from repeat offenders. That didn't work either. Nobles simply began holding multiple small funerals. Ah yes, this isn't a lavish wake, they'd say, this is simply my cousin's memorial, and the next one, and the next. By the end of his reign, Edward had achieved nothing, except inspiring one of the earliest examples of legal loopholing through semantics. But the idea of regulating grief caught on. In France, King Charles VI, also known as Charles the Mad, later tried something similar. His decree forbade excessive mourning attire. People were spending fortunes on black velvet and jeweled veils, which he considered a waste. Unfortunately, his reasoning was undermined slightly by the fact that he himself believed he was made of glass. So when the king, who thought he might shatter if touched, told his subjects to mourn with moderation, the public response was tepid. His courtiers complied publicly, of course, wearing simple linen at court, but the moment they left the palace, Paris once again filled with elegantly dressed widows and perfectly coordinated sorrow. Because fashion, even in grief, was apparently stronger than royal authority. Let's drift a little east now, to the Holy Roman Empire, where the Emperor Sigismund decided to fix a problem no one had asked him to fix: the length of feathers in men's hats. Feathers, you see, were status symbols. A longer feather meant greater prestige. But in the early 1400s, the trend got out of hand. Men began wearing entire bird wings on their heads, peacocks, cranes, even swans. Sigismund, ever the statesman, issued a decree limiting feathers to no longer than the bearer's forearm. Historians have no record of this law ever being enforced. What we do know is that, in portraits painted just a few years later, noblemen appear proudly displaying plumage that would put an ostrich to shame. It's a perfect summary of the imperial style of governance: make a rule, have a portrait taken, and then immediately ignore it. Now, in Castile, King Enrique IV, a man so perpetually unlucky he was nicknamed the Impotent, attempted a different kind of decree. He decided that Spain's chronic financial crises could be solved by outlawing debt. Not limiting debt. Outlawing it. Anyone caught lending or borrowing money with interest was to have their property seized and, in theory, be excommunicated. Within months, commerce nearly collapsed. Merchants fled to Portugal, contracts were voided, and even the royal treasury ran short on cash. So the king quietly repealed the decree less than a year later, claiming it had been misinterpreted by the unwise. Historians estimate that he lost more money enforcing his own law than he would have by simply doing nothing. There's something poetic about that. Let's move to France again, because France truly excelled at declaring laws that solved nothing. In 1321, Philip V decided to combat corruption in the royal administration. His great innovation was a decree requiring all officials to swear an oath declaring that they were not corrupt. That was it. That was the reform. They just had to say it out loud. Unsurprisingly, corruption levels remained exactly the same, except now officials were also technically guilty of perjury. Within a year, the king had to issue a second decree clarifying that oaths made falsely in service of the crown would not be punished if the accused later repented. Which, in practice, meant that lying was fine as long as you felt bad about it later. Medieval bureaucracy was, as always, deeply consistent in its inconsistency. But perhaps the most gloriously pointless decree of all came from Denmark. In 1423, King Eric of Pomerania was frustrated by rumors that his citizens were mocking him behind his back. So, naturally, he outlawed public laughter. For 6 weeks. The law stated that no man or woman shall laugh in public places, nor jest about the crown, nor mock the affairs of state. You can imagine how that went. Within days, the markets were full of people whispering jokes just quietly enough to be illegal. Taverns erupted in suppressed giggles. Even the clergy found ways to circumvent the rule by composing hymns with subtly humorous lyrics. The king rescinded the law after a month and a half, reportedly claiming it had served its purpose. Though what purpose that was remains unclear. It may comfort you to know that his reign ended with him being exiled to a castle on an island, a rather poetic punishment for a man who tried to ban laughter. Now, Italy. Because of course Italy couldn't resist getting involved. In Renaissance Florence, the city council decided to tackle public immorality. Their great innovation? A decree banning nighttime loitering without purpose. The problem was, no one could define purpose. So every night, hundreds of ordinary people, bakers, apprentices, lovers, travelers, were arrested for the crime of existing outside after sunset. The jails filled up so quickly that the council had to issue a second decree, clarifying that purpose could include walking home, praying, or simply thinking. And then, within the same year, they quietly abolished the entire system. A few chroniclers note that the city's only lasting consequence was the creation of a small, informal tradition among Florentine youth, wandering the streets at night while loudly declaring, "I have a purpose." Somehow, that feels fitting. Meanwhile, in Bohemia, King Wenceslas IV tried something equally futile. He noticed that his court was full of sycophants, men who praised him endlessly, hoping for favors. To discourage flattery, he issued a royal decree stating that no subject shall speak in praise of the sovereign in the royal presence. Within a week, the court grew eerily silent. Apparently, the king hated that too. He then issued an amendment permitting compliments of a factual nature, which, in medieval politics, might be the most cursed phrase ever written. So courtiers began saying things like, "Your Majesty appears to be breathing quite effectively today," or "The king's robe exists." He repealed the law within a month. A triumph of governance, as usual. Now, perhaps no royal decree was as hopeless as those involving food. Throughout the late Middle Ages, monarchs across Europe tried, and failed, to regulate what people ate. England's Edward II banned the sale of garlic in London because he hated the smell. Hungary's Louis I banned cabbage because his physician told him it caused melancholy. And in France, King Louis XI briefly outlawed onions in court cuisine after a noble fainted at dinner, apparently overwhelmed by their rustic odor. Within a year, all three kings had repealed their bans after realizing that food, inconveniently, tends to exist. But the most entertaining culinary decree came from the Papal States, where Pope Urban VI issued an order forbidding the serving of stuffed peacocks at banquets. His reasoning was that peacocks symbolized vanity. The real reason, however, was that a rival bishop had hosted a banquet featuring one such bird that was, by all accounts, far more impressive than the Pope's own feast. The pontiff's decree lasted about a decade before quietly vanishing from record, though not before inspiring several satirical paintings of cardinals eating peacocks behind closed doors. There's something quietly comforting about that level of predictable hypocrisy. As the centuries rolled on, Europe continued this noble tradition of pointless bans. Kings outlawed whether they didn't like. Dukes banned dances they couldn't perform. Queens prohibited fabrics that clashed with their complexion. Every royal ego needed a decree to go with it. And what did it all accomplish? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The same nobles kept their feathers. The same courtiers kept flattering. The same peasants kept laughing. The same cooks kept seasoning their onions. History rolled on, unimpressed. And maybe that's the real charm of these decrees. They remind us that power, for all its pomp, is remarkably fragile. A crown, a seal, a signature, none of it guarantees obedience. In the end, the world belongs to the ones who quietly ignore the rules. So if you ever feel frustrated by the absurdity of modern bureaucracy, take comfort. Things could be much worse. You could be living under a king who banned laughter, or a pope who banned birds, or an emperor who taxed feathers by the inch. The Middle Ages were 1,000 years of paperwork and ego. And through it all, humanity just kept doing what it does best, carrying on anyway. And maybe that's why these stories still feel oddly soothing. because they remind us that history isn't just grand battles and noble ideals. It's people, tired, proud, silly people, trying to control a world that never listens. So, as the night settles in and the candles gutter low, imagine all those kings sitting at their desks, furiously stamping decrees into irrelevance. The ink dries. The parchment curls. The world outside continues exactly as before. That's the real medieval miracle. Hey everyone, still here, still awake? If you are, that's fine. Tonight, we're floating back into the quieter corners of the Middle Ages, where fun itself was a suspicious activity. It's hard to imagine now, but for several centuries, joy was treated almost like contraband. Anything that looked remotely enjoyable, someone in power decided to ban it. Sometimes for moral reasons. Sometimes for political reasons. And occasionally, because a monarch had personally lost a bet and took it a little too seriously. Let's start in England again, because England had a particular knack for outlawing its own entertainment. In the 14th century, King Edward III issued one of the most humorless decrees in royal history. He banned football. Not modern football, but its medieval ancestor, a chaotic village-wide sport that involved dozens of people, a roughly inflated animal bladder, and no discernible rules. Matches often stretched from one parish to another, sometimes taking hours. There were no teams, no referees, and absolutely no safety precautions. The game's primary tactic was run into that man until something happens. Edward III's justification was beautifully bureaucratic. He claimed football distracted men from practicing archery, which, at the time, was considered a patriotic duty. In reality, it seems he just didn't like crowds of peasants shouting things beyond his control. The law called the game a great noise in the city, through which much harm is done. Naturally, everyone ignored it. The ban was renewed by nearly every English monarch for the next 300 years, proof that the best way to guarantee a tradition's survival is to make it illegal. By the Tudor period, Henry VIII, a man who truly embodied the phrase "rules for thee, not for me," had also prohibited football for commoners, yet built his own private pitch at Hampton Court. Apparently, royal football was perfectly acceptable. Now, while England was banning rough sports, France took a more personal approach to outlawing fun. In the early 1300s, Philip V decided to ban dice games. Gambling, he declared, led to the ruin of souls and purses. A moral sentiment, conveniently expressed just after the king himself had lost a staggering sum in a private game. The law forbade dice games for everyone except nobles, who, of course, could control their passions. So peasants were fined for tossing dice in taverns, while aristocrats threw gold across the same tables without consequence. It was a pattern that would repeat endlessly in medieval Europe. Pleasure was a privilege, not a pastime. But sometimes, even nobles weren't safe. Over in Bohemia, the court of King Wenceslas IV developed a passion for jousting tournaments. They were grand, expensive, and occasionally fatal, which was part of the fun. Unfortunately, one afternoon in 1389, a particularly disastrous match ended with 3 dead knights, a shattered viewing stand, and an injured noblewoman who happened to be the king's mistress. By sunset, Wenceslas declared all justice suspended until the Lord himself commands otherwise. He never lifted the ban. Contemporary accounts describe the sudden disappearance of tournaments as a grief to the spirits of youth, which is a very poetic medieval way of saying everyone was bored. The nobility tried to fill the void with feasting and poetry contests, both of which eventually descended into drinking games anyway. So much for reform. Meanwhile, in Florence, fun was not just discouraged, it was carefully monitored. In the late 15th century, the Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola took it upon himself to cleanse the city of sin. He organized what history now calls the bonfire of the vanities, mass burnings of anything deemed morally dangerous. Paintings, masks, cosmetics, even musical instruments. Children patrolled the streets collecting sinful objects to throw into the flames. He banned dancing, laughter, and public games. The city that had once defined the Renaissance turned quiet and gray. For a while, it worked. People obeyed out of fear or guilt. But then, inevitably, the pendulum swung back. Savonarola himself was eventually excommunicated, arrested, and, in a fitting twist, burned in the same square where his bonfires had once blazed. Florence, relieved, immediately returned to music, parties, and painting half-naked angels. Sometimes joy simply waits its turn. Elsewhere, the bands grew stranger. In Scotland, during the reign of James II, a law was passed forbidding golf and other unprofitable games. Much like England, Scotland wanted men practicing archery instead. It's a curious thought, a young Scot sneaking out with a wooden club and a leather ball, glancing over his shoulder as if committing a felony. The ban technically lasted for over 50 years, though by all accounts, the king himself enjoyed the game privately. A noble Scottish tradition: pretend you're against something, then do it anyway. Now, in Spain, Queen Isabella had a different concern: music. She adored religious hymns but despised secular songs, which she considered the gateway to idleness. Her courtiers were forbidden from singing instruments of courtly love. One chronicler noted that after her decree, many noblemen learned to hum softly in corners. Of course, her grandson Charles V later became one of Europe's most enthusiastic patrons of music. The Habsburgs, ever consistent in their contradictions. Meanwhile, in northern Germany, the city of Lübeck banned card games on Sundays, on the grounds that they led to swearing. The punishment? Sitting in church for an extra service while everyone stared at you. It didn't take long for that to become a social game in itself. People deliberately got caught just to make friends in the sinner's pew. Which, in a very German way, turned penitence into networking. Now, you might think that only common entertainments were banned, things involving drink, dice, or dance. But even intellectual amusements weren't safe. In Paris, the University of the Sorbonne issued a decree in the early 15th century forbidding students from playing chess. Why? Because the game was too distracting from the pursuit of virtue. Imagine a medieval scholar sneaking into a candlelit dormitory with a folded board under his robe. Quickly, brother, before the dean returns, a quiet game of strategy and sin. Chess survived, of course, because like most good ideas, it's extremely difficult to outlaw thought. Now, perhaps the most surprising bans came not from kings, but from towns and parishes themselves. Throughout medieval Europe, certain communities periodically outlawed dancing. It sounds absurd, but it happened everywhere. In England, dancing was condemned as a gateway to pride. In parts of Germany, it was said to tempt the devil's company. And in Switzerland, one town went as far as to ban the sound of fiddles after dusk. The result? People simply danced in silence. There are accounts of entire village squares moving rhythmically with no music at all, a strangely haunting rebellion against piety. It must have looked eerie. Dozens of figures stepping and swaying beneath torchlight, moving to a rhythm they could only hear in their heads. For a brief, quiet moment, fun became invisible. And perhaps that was the point. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that joy doesn't disappear when forbidden, it just learns to hide. Even the church itself occasionally tried to suppress pleasure in its own ranks. One papal edict from the 12th century forbade monks from telling tales of beasts or spirits. Apparently, monastic storytelling had grown so creative that abbots feared the brothers were enjoying themselves too much. So the church banned entertainment during meals, no singing, no jokes, and no stories. Which, of course, meant that monasteries soon became the birthplace of silent theater. The monks acted out biblical scenes in pantomime. Without words, but with exaggerated gestures. The result was both wholly and unintentionally hilarious. Imagine a silent performance of Noah's Ark performed by solemn men in robes, gesturing wildly to invisible animals. Even God, one suspects, would have allowed a chuckle. And then there were bands that targeted festivals, the beating heart of medieval happiness. May Day celebrations were often condemned for licentious conduct, particularly the tradition of young men and women disappearing into the woods to gather flowers. Repeatedly, towns tried to outlaw it. And repeatedly, the laws failed. The maypole would rise again every spring, and the people would dance around it anyway, perhaps a little faster, perhaps with fewer witnesses, but always with the same quiet defiance. The church even banned the Feast of Fools, a raucous festival where lower clergy dressed as bishops and mocked authority for a day. It was, admittedly, chaos, parody sermons, singing donkeys, drunken processions through cathedrals. But it was also the one time a year ordinary people could laugh at the system that ruled them. So naturally, it had to go. The papacy condemned the feast in the 15th century, calling it blasphemous and beastly. Within a decade, every major cathedral in France had reinstated it in secret. Because humor, it turns out, is just as sacred as reverence. Looking back, it's almost funny, the endless cycle of banning joy, only to watch it rise again. Kings tried to silence laughter, priests outlawed music, councils forbade games. And yet, the people kept playing, kept singing, kept dancing under the stars. Maybe that's why the Middle Ages, for all their darkness, never truly lost their warmth. Because behind every law, there was a loophole. Behind every sermon, a smirk. The forbidden games never really died. They just waited for the right moment to start again. So as you drift off tonight, imagine those silent dancers, those gamblers whispering over dice, those peasants kicking a tattered ball through muddy fields. The laughter muffled, the joy restrained, but still there. Because even in the most repressed centuries of human history, fun found a way.